What's up, guys and gals, G.I. Joe fans? Here's a look at something nearly 20 years old. It can be considered vintage, but you know, it's not like when you hear vintage, you think of like the original 1980s G.I. Joes. But in my opinion, vintage can be anything like over 10 years old. And this pack right here, this is like 17 years old. So this is the 2001 G.I. Joe versus Cobra, Duke versus Cobra Commander. I actually collected these back then. It was an interesting time because it was pretty much the first really new versions of G.I. Joe since the original 1980s design. So first of all, before I continue, big thanks to Chris, the bro Chris, aka Rex Flex All 69, for hooking me up with this pack. This actually brought back some memories. So, you know, to continue what I was saying is, you know, in 2001, we hadn't gotten any really new design for G.I. Joe, you know, since the original. We'd gotten the Real American Hero collection, which was a reissues of the original like vintage Joes and stuff. But this was a bold new venture for G.I. Joe. And I want to say largely it kind of flopped. If it's not obvious, if it's not glaringly obvious, you know, especially if you're not a G.I. Joe fan, you're not too familiar with these. I'll get to why in a second, but just real quick, here's a look at the packaging. Packaging is pretty cool. They started out with 2 packs. Actually, I think they remained 2 packs for the duration of the line. I'm not 100% sure, but if I remember right. Anyway, and then on the back, this is interesting because, again, you know, it was like a bold new venture into G.I. Joe, and the artwork for this all new version of G.I. Joe was really cool. So look at that artwork. I mean, it is comic style artwork, but then, you know, the character designs and the way they're drawn is very dynamic. And then the actual figures kind of fell short of that, which is a shame because it was like, wow, imagine if they actually looked as cool as this artwork. That would have been really cool. So there you have it. And, oh, let's go ahead and read this. G.I. Joe is a codename for America's daring, highly trained special mission force. Its purpose? To defend freedom and justice against Cobra, an evil organization determined to rule the world. The G.I. Joe team is made up of experts in different disciplines, and they fight for freedom wherever there's trouble, on the land, on the sea, or in the air. Led by Duke, the courageous sergeant, the G.I. Joe team must be ever vigilant to stop the evil plans of Cobra Commander and his forces. G.I. Joe, a real American hero. So, there you go. 2001. So, you know, this pack, and sorry, Chris, if you're a sealed collector, but this is about to get ripped open. So, one more time, there's the packaging. Let's crack this open and take a closer look at these figures. Okay, there's the figures, but before we take a closer look at those, let's take a look in the packaging. This was the back, and each of them came with a different background that was, you know, it's not really in scale with them, but still kind of cool. Cool artwork. And then the file cards were quite different as well from the original vintage ones. Similar, very similar, mostly just in the shape. And then there was a little pamphlet. I always love these things. It shows all the characters, not actual pictures of the figures, but again, that artwork, and then some coming soon for the second series. And again, the artwork just looks so much cooler than the figures actually came out. Plus some of the vehicles, and I actually had all these at the time, but have long since gotten rid of those. And then on the other side of that, all the characters in the first series, and again, that artwork is just so awesome. So anyway, all right, so let's take a look at Duke first. So one of the biggest differences from the original 1980s and 90s G.I. Joes was, well, if you're a G.I. Joe fan, then you'd know. The biggest, most obvious reason or difference, the lack of the O-ring design, which ironically they did away with again later with the 25th anniversary and newer, and that worked. But for these, it wasn't so much throwing out the O-ring design, it was other things. So the plastic was different, and of course the lack of articulation, that was the biggest thing. And if I remember right, in the second series of these, they actually fixed that. So they were a little better articulated, but still, as you can see, you know, the proportions also very different. They were, you know, a little more stylized, more buff. It's almost like kind of like Power of the Force 2, you know, like the first ones. You know, you would think Hasbro would have learned their lesson, but still, the designs themselves are pretty cool. It was the biggest thing was, at the time anyway, you know, was the lack of articulation, the O-ring. But still pretty cool. Duke here has a few accessories. He has a pistol, oversized. It's almost like that can be a 6-inch scale pistol, and I believe that can go in the holster right there. He has G.I. Joe printed on both boots. He has a backpack, and I think this opens down here. I can't get it to open, but I think that opens, but let's just go ahead and throw that on. Backpack, he has a walkie, radio, and as well as this rifle right here. And of course, with the lack of articulation, you know, you can't get them to really hold their weapons, you know, properly. If anything, you know, these would still be great toys for kids, since all those things that collectors, you know, are important to collectors, you know, won't really bother them. But part of me wants to think that at the time they were kind of aiming to get these, you know, to do these for the longtime G.I. Joe fans and collectors, which, you know, would be adults at the time. So that's Duke. Let's see if we can get him to sandbag. You know what? Let's go ahead and lay him down. And then we've got Cobra Commander. Now, aside from the proportions, and I think there's a bit of discoloration here because of the age already, but aside from the proportions and, you know, the lack of articulation, I really like the design of this Cobra Commander. It really was a really cool modern version of a hooded Cobra Commander. He actually looks pretty mean and menacing and kind of ready for battle, not like the somewhat silly Cobra Commander that you would remember from the cartoon. But, you know, again, there's the lack of articulation, and still, you know, it's cool as just a toy. But, you know, as collectors, we demand more. We want that articulation, we want that detail, we want realistic proportions, we want these guys to be able to hold their weapons. Speaking of which, This Cobra Commander comes with a rifle, which is, I want to say it's slightly oversized and you can't really hold that properly. This, I don't know what you want to call it, probably a laser blaster. And kind of like the vintage version. No, I don't think that, no, that actually does not plug onto his back. There's that. And then he comes with this Uzi, which that one is better proportioned. And, but again, you know, this, I don't know if it's just me, but I think this Cobra Commander actually looks really cool. Like, he looks badass. Like, it's almost like this design exactly could have transferred well into like a 25th anniversary to Pursuit of Cobra style Cobra Commander. Although we got some really cool ones as well in the modern, in the lines to follow, like 2007 and later. But still, that is a pretty cool Cobra Commander. So there you have it. Thanks again to Chris RexFlexall69 for hooking me up with these bring back memories, because you know I've been collecting G.I. Joe since I was a kid, since the originals, and all throughout. And this era, you know, the early 2000s, it was an interesting era. It was far from great, but for the time it was pretty cool because it was bold and we were getting, you know, all these new takes on characters as well as some new characters. Some of them which actually, I think some of those characters that got created during that era actually carried on into the modern Joe. So anyway, there you have it. This Duke and Cobra Commander. I still think the designs are pretty cool. Just the execution is kind of lacking. You know, the proportions and of course the lack of articulation. But in my opinion, you know, and only some of you who are also G.I. Joe collectors or, you know, fans of 4-inch military and stuff, these can go well with the core figures because of their design style. So it could be a cool way to do a G.I. Joe and core crossover. So there you have it again, G.I. Joe versus Cobra, Duke and Cobra Commander.